it's long, and it's very intellectual. Okay, and I think that what we look at is when you're talking about the style, you're looking at a style that is a mix between colloquial in some of her terms, okay, but still very academic. And so it's important to bear in mind who is the actual audience, okay? Who is the audience for this? And so she's speaking to obviously a very intelligent university audience, okay? An audience that is aware of her literary allusions that go all the way through the text. So when we're looking at it, we start thinking about how does she set up her argument? How does she establish her point? And what techniques does she use in order to do that? Now, the most obvious one that we look for, and we're not going to highlight each of these ones, but there's that element of intertextuality. So she draws upon famous texts to support her core argument. And her core argument, who can think what her core argument is? Yep.
The evolving nature of literature as impacted by history.
Excellent. So the evolving nature of literature, and more so that, and to expand upon that, so the evolving nature of literature, but also the role of women within literature, and the fact that if female characters need to be displayed as real, and in that sense that they can be just as villainous as men.
Like human flaws are still present in women.
Perfect. So that idea of the human flaws existing within women, and how, so she talks about, and she starts with an anecdote from her childhood. So when she starts with an anecdote from her childhood, the anecdote being what her brother would sing to her. Now, obviously, whenever you bring an anecdote into it, you're trying to create a sense of like a personal relationship with the audience. So that starts with the first part when he brings, there was a little girl who had a little curl. And she makes the point of saying that her older brother used the verse to tease me. He did manage to make very, very good sound almost worse than horrid. And she agrees with that premise because she says if your characters are completely faultless, they're not as strong and as boring. Yep.
I thought that from there she was going on the fact that by emphasizing the very, very good, that she's perpetually not going to achieve that because that's the standard that women are held to based on that nursery.
No, well, so there is, in terms of that concept. So she's saying that is like it's a false concept. She's arguing it and she's pacing it up as a false paradigm. Okay, that exists. And so when she goes through, she starts with and she makes it very, very clear that if you're looking at it, this spotty-handed villainess as the title of the thing, it's Lady Macbeth, and you guys would all be aware of Lady Macbeth, okay? And so she's saying that she is a rich textual character that existed through time, and the fact that she existed wasn't to the detriment of women, okay? And so throughout her text, she talks about how just because there are if we were to say that creating bad women, and I use that in inverted commas, okay, creating bad women or characters with real flaws as women, if that was true and that led to a negative portrayal of women, had negative effects, and she's arguing that some feminist writers will argue that, okay, she says if that's true, then all men would be depraved because the majority of the characters that are evil within text are men, okay? So she's basically saying there's an argument that would have an impact on both. Yep.
Because she keeps referring to Lady Macbeth, could you say she's a motif?
You could say she's a motive or like a central argument. So she's a central character within the argument. Okay, so either way you can talk about it because it's an illusion that she comes back to. She creates a juxtaposition between Lady Macbeth and Ophelia. So, but they both, and what it's saying is they both end. And the line that we look at is. So this is in the third paragraph down. Spot is in guilt, spot is in blood, spot is in outdamned. So obviously there's anaphora there, the spot, spot, spot. Lady Macbeth was spotted, Ophelia unspotted, both came to sticky ends, but there's a world of difference. And from that she's suggesting that world of difference exists in the richness of their character. The richness of that character that exists between the two of them. Because Ophelia is a passive victim within the the text, whereas Lady Macbeth is that stronger character. And so she poses a question, which she then goes to answer. And you could say that, and this is a fancier term that you could use, she employs the Socratic method. Socratic method. So that comes from Socrates, so the philosopher who would ask questions and then answer them. Socratic. So she starts that. So where was I before Gabby rudely interrupted me? Yeah. So but is it not today, well, somehow unfeminist to depict a woman behaving badly? Isn't bad behavioral? So these series of rhetorical questions that she's throwing out, she will then answer as she goes through. Okay, and so that in doing that, that's how she sets up her argument, and that's an important point to be aware of.
Doesn't that just like make the audience more eager, more involved in it?
Good. So in terms of that, but the thing is, at the basis level, when we look at rhetorical questions, the easiest thing to say is is used to engage the audience. By lifting it to talking about how it helps to structure her argument, you're heightening your analysis of it. Does that make sense? So if you simply say that it engages, there's a limit to that. And so we go through that, and she tells a story, again, another anecdote, but this time talking about her own daughter, putting on a play, and how nothing happens. And you need something to happen. And so she then moves into the very nature of fiction and the role of fiction within the world. And and that leads her to start talking about, well, what is a novel? And in doing that, she starts talking about the fact that a novel is many faceted things, and again, creates that link, that dichotomy that exists between the fictional world and the real world, and how there needs to be a coexistence between the two. How true fiction, true literature needs to reflect the world. If we go down to on page 18 and the third paragraph down, she says the kind of questions I'm talking about have to do with how the characters in novels ought to behave. Unfortunately, there is a widespread tendency to judge such characters as if they were job applicants, or public servants, or prospective roommates, or somebody you're considering marrying. For instance, I sometimes get a question, almost always these days from women, that goes something like this: why don't you make the men stronger? I feel that this is a matter which should more properly be taken up with God. It was not after all, I who created Adam, so subject to temptation that he sacrificed eternal life for an apple. Which leads me to believe that God, who is, among other things, an author, is just as enamored of character flaws and dire plots as we human writers are. The characters in the average novel are not usually folks you would want to get involved with at a personal or business level. How then should we go about responding to such creations? Or from my side of the page, which is blank when I begin, how should I go about creating them? So that's a good example to start talking about again, that real understanding of the fact that we as humans are flawed and our work should reflect that. There's a biblical allusion there, obviously, to the story in Genesis, and she again uses that structural framework of a question that she will respond to. So she sets up She sets up an argument that she's on both sides of. Okay, so she sets up the question, and then responds to that as she goes through. And she starts with that movement. So that idea of she starts with the notion of the characters and how characters should be displayed, and uses that to talk about uses that as a transition to talk about novels and as pieces of works, what should they do? And so she goes, and an example of that is, what is a novel anyway? And so there's no definitive answer to that. And she's talking about, we con artists do tell the truth in a way, but as Emily Dickinson said, we tell it slant. By indirection, we find direction out. So here, for easy reference, is an elimination dance list of what novels are not. And so there's that anaphora that exists within that novels are not, novels are not, novels are not. And as you go through that, you'll see by eliminating what they're not, she starts to create within us an understanding of what they should be. An example of this would be, again on page 18, where she says, novels are not not how-to books. They will not show you how to conduct a successful life, although some of them may be read this way. Is Pride and Prejudice about how a sensible middle-class 19th century woman can snare an appropriate man with good income, which is the best she can hope for out of life, given the limitations of her situation? Partly, but not completely. So she's saying that even those texts that are lost in a real so like bound by their context, okay, such as that text. There's more to it than that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a novel, okay. And just like that, and so that if we can see, actually, I'll ask you, who can think why she would be presenting this novels when she's talking about the female characters? Why is she presenting this talk of novels? Yeah.
One, novels would be something that'd be common across all forms of literature.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking from poems to narratives, and normally when you write a novel, it's projected from your own social environment. So throughout history, novels have been anywhere from Snow White, anywhere from The Prince and the Dragon, Saving the Princess. You projected beliefs of people and social classes and how genders and stuff have their value through this kind of story. And as history's progressed, so has novels. There's still that dragon and that princess story, but now we've got a larger vocabulary of novels where you've also got novels where it's a female protagonist saving male protagonist, or it's just two female protagonists saving each other, and you're looking at how novels have adapted from history here, and the progression of feminism has been shown through novels, and novels have led to the progression of feminism. It's like a dichotomy that through these novels gaining their ideas and explaining them like that, people are understanding that there's a second kind of way to view it and not just the typical high value.
Yeah, and in terms of and just again to summarize in that, there's obviously there's that change and development of novels as an art form, but it also saying there's a linking between the notion of female characters and not the novel as an art form, because what it's saying is if novels are not just this, female characters and femininity is not just this as well, okay? And that's an important thing to talk about. So there's that binary that exists that she's creating here, that's saying by examining what novels that novels are more than just these things, and they're not limited to this. There's no strict definition of it. Neither is there a strict definition of what the female character should be.
Could you link that to like the genre theory of the author instead? So it depends on the different historical representations.
You can, but you don't want to get too embedded in that stuff. Okay. And so if you're looking down, and we're moving down to page 19, and we're looking at the critic looking at the plot asks, what's happening here? The novelist creating plot asks, what happens next? The critic asks, is this believable? The novelist, how can I get them to believe this? The novelist, echoing Marshall McLuhan's famous dictum that art is what you can get away with, says, how can I pull this off? As if the novel itself were a kind of bank robbery, whereas the critic is liable to exclaim, in the mode of policemen making the arrest, aha, you can't get away with that. In short, the novelist's concerns are more practical than those of the critic, more concerned with how to, less concerned with metaphysics. Any novelist, whether his or her theoretical interests are, has to contend with the following how-to questions. What kind of story shall I choose to tell it? Is it instant, comic or tragic or melodramatic or all? So in that point, obviously there's a technique where she creates that conversation. Okay, so she creates a conversation between the novelist and the critic, and she's really talking about that development of the novel and how that should be central to it. Okay, and so the questioning and this kind of leads to a culmination of this argument about the novel. It moves beyond just saying like what this novel is or isn't. It's more saying that the characters themselves should fit in with the purpose of that novel and what they're trying to get away with it. And they shouldn't be limited by trying to create these virtuous characters, because in doing so, you're limiting that art form. And so and she moves to that saying, let's put a woman this at the bottom of page 19. Let's put a woman at the center of something other than breakfast and see what happens. Now there's a whole new set of questions. Will the conflict be supplied by the natural world? Is our female protagonist lost in the jungle, caught in a hurricane, pursued by sharks? If so, the story will be an adventure story and her job is to run away, or else to combat the sharks, displaying courage and fortitude, or else cowardice and stupidity. If there is a man in the story as well, the plot will alter in other directions. He'll be a rescuer, an enemy, a companion in struggle, a sex bomb, or someone rescued by the woman. Once upon a time, the first would have been the more probable. That is more believable to the reader. But times have changed and art is what you can get away with. And the other possibilities have entered the picture. And that's an important thing to look at. Okay, and it leads to what Vlatko said about that changing in the context and the changing in the what novels are. And so in this, she's saying that idea of what art is, what you can get away with, and she repeats that. So there's repetition used there. And so she's saying that once upon a time, women could only play the role of being the person in need of rescuing, the person who is lost, the passive components within the literature. And what she's saying, though, is that's a falsehood now. Women and society is able to understand that women are capable of more than that. And so in that, there's a criticism of the feminist movement that has become very extreme in her eyes. That would say that presenting women in that negative light, once again, is a bad thing. When what she's saying is society is capable of understanding that women are multifaceted. Okay? And so, again, that's something that's very, very important to look at. Now, obviously, she goes through, and we're going to actually move down to page 21, on the top of page 21. To summarize some of the benefits to literature of the women's movement, the expansion of the territory available to writers, both in character and language, a sharp-eyed examination of the way power works. So she goes through listing some of these, the things that have improved in terms of her role within the feminist movement and the development of women as characters. So it's the top of 21. But she says the point. Some writers tended to polarize morality by gender. That is, women were intrinsically good and men bad. To divide along religious lines. That is, women who slept with men were sleeping with the enemy. To judge by tribal markings. That is, women who wore high heels and makeup were instantly suspect. Those in overalls were acceptable. And to make hopeful excuses. That is, defects in women were ascribable to the patriarchal system and would cure themselves once the system was abolished. Such oversimplifications may be necessary to some phases of political movements, but are usually problematical for novelists, unless the novelist has a secret desire to be in billboard advertising. And that's a real criticism there of that movement within the feminist movement that creates these dichotomies, that creates that men are bad, women are good. And she's saying there's an inherent danger in that, just as it's just as patronizing if it was to come from the male view of women as it was from women doing it. And in actual fact, if you look at it, it's a movement back to how women were depicted. So if you're drawing back on that when she talks about Pride and Prejudice, it's a movement back to women being these need of protection. These people who are incapable of character development. Now, I'm going to stop there for a moment, and next lesson I'm going to finish off the speech. What I would ask you to do, please, is I've given you this summary. It's a very nice summary that I found for you. And what I would like you to do is, I know you were rushed reading through it. Can I please ask of you tonight to read through this summary with the speech itself? And I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what are the main ideas within it. And it does say some ideas within there, but I want you to have your own understanding of that. Try and find a couple of quotes that support that. And also think about how you can make relation to different speeches. I think you can make a relation from this to Keating's speech as well as Pearson's speech. Now, in Pearson's speech, a relationship that I'd be making is in terms of style and audience. Okay? To Keating's speech, and this one works with Pearson as well, you change the notion of national identity to the idea of identity. Okay? And so she's really talking about that establishment of identity. All right, I'll see you tomorrow, guys. Yeah, so if you change it to identity as the thematic concern and change one to national and one to hers. All right, I'm just figuring out how to turn this thing off. Yeah. Oh, there it is.